Take a breath right now. Just a normal breath, the kind you always take without thinking about it. Don't change anything. Just breathe like you always do. Now I want you to put one hand on your chest and one hand on your belly, and just notice which one moved. Did your chest rise and your shoulders come up slightly? Or did your belly push outward like something is expanding low and slow below your ribs? Because I've spent the last several months going deep into a body of research that I genuinely was not prepared for, and what I kept running into and over. From cardiologists, from neuroscientists, from cell biologists, was this one finding sitting at the center of everything, that the answer to that question, that simple thing you just did, is one of the strongest physical predictors we have of how fast your body is biologically aging right now. Not your cholesterol, not your resting heart rate, not even your weight. But the mechanics of something you do 17 zeros and times a day without paying any attention to it. And the muscle responsible for that, the muscle almost nobody talks about when you're talking about aging, is your diaphragm. Now, I already know what some of you are thinking. Diaphragm, breathing exercises, mindfulness, meditation. You've heard some version of this before, and I want to stop that train of thought right now and redirect it, because what I'm going to show you today is not that. What I want to walk through is the actual biological mechanism, the chain of events inside your body at the level of your nervous system, your hormones, your immune cells, and eventually your DNA, by which that one muscle is either slowing your aging or accelerating it depending on how it's working. This is not a wellness conversation. This is a biology conversation. And the science here, honestly, surprised me more than almost anything I've read in this space. So let's actually go through it together the way I think it should be done. Starting with what's really happening and building from there. Let me start with something that might reframe how you think about aging entirely, because I don't think most people have a clear picture of what's actually going on. When people think about aging, they picture the surface stuff. Gray hair, wrinkles, joints that don't cooperate in the morning. But those things, all of them are just the visible output of a much deeper process. The real machinery of aging is operating at a scale you can't see, and it's been running since most of us were in our 20s. Inside almost every cell in your body, at the very tips of your chromosomes, there are these structures called telomeres. If you want a good analogy, think of the little plastic caps on the ends of a shoelace. Those plastic tips exist for one reason: to stop the shoelace from fraying. Telomeres do exactly the same thing for your chromosomes. They protect the genetic information stored there from degrading every time the cell divides. And here's the thing. Every time a cell divides, those telomeres get a little shorter. This is normal. This is how biological aging happens at the cellular level. When telomeres get short enough, the cell enters what scientists call senescence. It's still alive technically, but it's stopped functioning properly. It sits there releasing inflammatory signals, disrupting the tissue around it, and accumulating with other senescent cells until the whole neighborhood starts to break down. This is what we mean when we say aging at the cellular level. It's not death, it's something almost worse. It's cells going rogue. Now, here's the part that changes everything about how you should think about this. The rate at which your telomeres are shortening is not fixed. It is not a biological clock ticking at the same speed for everyone. The rate of shortening is variable, and it's being driven significantly, measurably, in ways that have been confirmed in peer-reviewed literature by two things happening inside you right now: chronic inflammation and elevated cortisol. The rate at which your telomeres are shortening is not fixed. It is being driven by chronic inflammation and elevated cortisol. Dr. Alyssa Appel and Nobel laureate Dr. Elizabeth Blackburn at UC San Francisco published the landmark paper on this in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2004. What they found in a study of women who were the primary caregivers for chronically ill children, people living under real, sustained psychological stress, is that the perception of chronic stress was associated with significantly shorter telomeres and lower telomerase activity. Telomerase is the enzyme that helps maintain and repair telomere length, and in the most stressed individuals, both the telomeres and their repair capacity were degraded compared to low-stress controls. Now, in more recent work, researchers built on this to map out the full mechanistic pathway. A research group published what they called the neuroimmunosenescence integrative model. And what this model showed is that there's a very specific chain of events connecting your stress physiology to your DNA. Here's how it works. Low vagal tone, meaning weak activity in the parasympathetic part of your nervous system, is associated with higher levels of inflammatory proteins called IL-6 and TNF-alpha circulating in your blood. These inflammatory proteins activate a pathway inside your cells called NF-kappa B. When NF-kappa B is turned on, your cells produce reactive oxygen species, essentially tiny molecular sparks happening inside the cell. And these reactive oxygen species damage DNA. They preferentially damage the tips of chromosomes. They preferentially damage telomeres, so the chain goes. Chronically elevated stress physiology leads to low vagal tone, leads to high inflammation, leads to oxidative stress, leads to accelerated telomere shortening. That's the path, and what sits at the upstream control point of all of it, the lever that sets the tone of your entire autonomic nervous system, is, in large part, how your diaphragm is functioning every day. That's the claim. Now let's go prove it. Let me tell you what the diaphragm actually is, because I think most people have a vague, approximate idea. And the real picture is much more interesting. Your diaphragm is a dome-shaped sheet of muscle. Imagine a parachute with a curve in it that sits at the base of your rib cage, separating your chest cavity from your abdominal cavity. It's your primary breathing muscle. When it contracts and flattens downward, it increases the volume of your chest cavity. Air rushes in. When it relaxes back into its dome shape, volume decreases. Air goes out. That's breathing. That's what it's designed to do. The thing is, for that to work the way it's supposed to, your belly has to move. Because when the diaphragm descends, it pushes downward into the abdominal cavity. Your organs shift slightly, and that movement has to go somewhere. So your belly expands outward. That's why when you're breathing correctly, you see the belly moving, not just the chest. Now, here's where most people have a problem, and this is actually more common than most of us realize. When you sit for most of the day at a desk, in a car, in front of a screen, your posture naturally compresses the abdominal cavity. There's nowhere for the diaphragm to descend into, so your body compensates. It recruits what are called accessory breathing muscles, the scalenes, the sternocleidomastoid, the upper trapezius. These are muscles in your neck and upper chest that can pull your rib cage up and outward to create space for air. It gets the job done, but it does it in a way that has serious physiological consequences. For one thing, breathing with your neck and upper chest muscles all day is exhausting for those muscles. This is part of why people who sit at desks for long hours have chronically tight necks and shoulders. They're using those muscles to breathe. 17,000 times a day, every day, they're contracting muscles that were designed for turning your head and stabilizing your neck, and instead using them to breathe. But that's almost a cosmetic problem compared to what's happening neurologically. When you breathe with your chest and neck, you're activating the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight side, more than you would with diaphragmatic breathing. Each shallow chest breath sends a subtle stress signal through your nervous system. Not a loud acute signal, not like you're running from something, just a low-level hum of sympathetic activation. 17,000 times a day. That hum keeps your nervous system slightly elevated, slightly braced, slightly in a mode of readiness. And over months and years, that persistent background activation adds up into exactly the chronic stress physiology we were just talking about. The elevated cortisol, the low vagal tone, the inflammatory signaling that accelerates cellular aging. Most people who have this pattern don't know they have it. They feel vaguely tired. They feel like they can't quite relax. They notice that stress hits them harder than it used to, or that recovery after exercise takes longer, and they attribute it to getting older or to their job or just to life. But the upstream driver in a lot of cases is a breathing pattern they've had for 20 years without ever examining it. Let me introduce you to a structure in your body that I think deserves more attention than it gets. It's called the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve. It starts in your brainstem, literally at the base of your brain, and then it takes the longest journey of any nerve in your body. It runs down through your neck. It branches around your heart. It weaves through your lungs. It passes right alongside the diaphragm, and it extends all the way down through your intestines, your stomach, your liver, your spleen. The Latin word vagus actually means wandering, and that's exactly what it does. Now, here's the fact about the vagus nerve that I find genuinely mind-bending. Approximately 80% of its fibers are afferent, meaning they carry signals from your body up to your brain. Not the other way around. Most people assume the brain is always sending commands downward, control flowing from the top. But the vagus nerve is mostly an upward channel. Your gut is constantly sending information to your brain. Your heart is, your lungs are, and your breathing is sending an enormous volume of signals up through this nerve, second by second, to the part of your brainstem that's setting the baseline tone of your entire autonomic nervous system. When you breathe deeply and slowly, when the diaphragm is doing its job and descending fully, the mechanical movement of the chest cavity stimulates baroreceptors in the aortic arch and carotid sinus. These are pressure sensors in your major blood vessels. The signal from those sensors travels up the vagus nerve to the brainstem and activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest side. Your heart rate slows slightly, your adrenal glands ease up, your immune system shifts away from inflammatory mode. Your body gets the message, nothing is wrong. Stand down. When you breathe shallowly with your chest, when the diaphragm isn't working properly, those baroreceptors aren't stimulated in the same way. The signal going up the vagus nerve is different, quieter, and without that regular parasympathetic input, the nervous system defaults towards sympathetic dominance. The baseline state of the body tips slightly, persistently, toward vigilance. This is not subtle stuff. This is the fundamental regulation of your physiology. And the diaphragm is the mechanical pump that either sends the right signal or doesn't. Now let me connect this to a measurement you may have heard about, but maybe haven't fully understood, because this is where the real data lives. Heart rate variability, HRV. Your resting heart rate tells you how fast your heart is beating on average. That's one number. But HRV tells you something different. It measures the variation in time between individual heartbeats. Even when your heart is beating at 60 beats per minute, the time between each beat isn't exactly 1 second. It varies, sometimes 0.9 seconds, sometimes 1.1 seconds. That variation has a pattern, and the pattern reveals the state of your autonomic nervous system with remarkable precision. High HRV, lots of organized variation between beats, means your parasympathetic system is strong and active. Your body is flexible. It can respond to demands and then recover. This is what healthy, resilient physiology looks like. Low HRV, very uniform, rigid beat-to-beat intervals, means sympathetic dominance. Your body is in a state of sustained tension. It's bracing. Here's what the data says about HRV and aging. Multiple large epidemiological studies have found that low HRV is a strong independent predictor of all-cause mortality, not just heart disease, all causes. And separately, research published in the journal Frontiers in Human Neuroscience has documented a clear mechanistic link between vagally mediated HRV and cellular aging, specifically through the same inflammatory pathway we went through earlier. Low HRV means more IL-6. More IL-6 means more NF-kappa B activation. More NF-kappa B means more oxidative stress. More oxidative stress means faster telomere shortening. HRV declines with age. A young healthy adult might have an HRV in a range that indicates strong vagal tone. By the time most people reach their 60s and 70s, that number has often dropped significantly. That decline doesn't happen in isolation. It tracks almost perfectly with the rise in inflammatory markers, the acceleration of cellular aging, the decline in cognitive function, the increased vulnerability to disease. It's not the only driver of all that, but it's one of the most central ones we've found. Now, here's the thing that makes all of this actually matter to you personally right now. HRV is trainable. It is not a fixed number written in your genetics. It's a reflection of the current state of your autonomic nervous system, and that state is highly responsive to how you're breathing. Researchers discovered what they call the resonance frequency of the cardiovascular system, the breathing rate at which HRV is maximally amplified. That rate sits at approximately 6 breaths per minute, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. When you breathe at that rhythm, your heart rate oscillations and your breathing oscillations synchronize. They go into a kind of biological resonance. And at that resonance point, vagal tone goes up, HRV goes up, and cortisol goes measurably down. A study published in Frontiers in Psychology put this to the test in a controlled design. One group received 20 sessions of diaphragmatic breathing training over 8 weeks using real-time feedback devices at a rate of approximately 4 to 6 breaths per minute. The control group did not receive this training. What happened? The breathing group showed significantly lower salivary cortisol concentrations at the end of the study, and they showed improvements in sustained attention and effect. The breathing group showed significantly lower cortisol concentrations and improvements in sustained attention. These are not soft self-reported outcomes. Cortisol is a biochemical measurement. The effect was real and reproducible. I want to go deeper on cortisol now, because I think the way most people understand it is incomplete. And if you don't fully understand what chronic cortisol does, you can't really appreciate what's at stake. Cortisol is produced by your adrenal glands, and it exists for a very good reason. In an acute crisis, in genuine physical danger, cortisol is your body's mobilization hormone. It raises blood glucose to fuel your muscles. It temporarily suppresses inflammation so you don't get slowed down by your immune system at the wrong moment. It sharpens alertness. In acute situations, cortisol is brilliant. The problem is the design mismatch between the system and the environment. The human stress response was built for threats that arrive, peak, and then resolve. A predator shows up. You run or you fight. The threat ends. Cortisol spikes and then drops. Your body recovers. The system resets. That's the cycle it evolved for. What we have now is the opposite. The stresses of modern life are chronic, low-grade, and almost never fully resolved. Financial pressure that's been there for years. Work demands that arrive at all hours. Social anxiety that has no clean endpoint. The body never receives a clear, all-clear signal. So cortisol never fully drops back to baseline. It stays elevated, not at crisis levels, not in a way you'd necessarily feel as intense stress, but chronically elevated above where it should be during rest. And here's what that does to your body over time. First, it activates inflammatory gene expression. The key player here is the transcription factor NF-kappa B that I mentioned earlier. Sustained cortisol signaling, particularly in the chronic pattern we're talking about, activates this pathway in your immune cells. It causes a persistent upregulation of inflammatory cytokines, IL-6, TNF-alpha, C-reactive protein. These are the molecules that show up in blood panels as markers of systemic inflammation. They're associated with virtually every major age-related disease we know. Heart disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, certain cancers. Chronic low-grade inflammation is the common biological thread running through all of them. Researchers have even coined a word for it, inflammaging, because the overlap between aging and inflammation is so consistent across the scientific literature. Second, chronic cortisol produces what are called reactive oxygen species, highly reactive molecular fragments that essentially damage cells from the inside. Your cells have antioxidant defense systems to manage this. But when the production of reactive oxygen species consistently outpaces the cleanup capacity, the damage accumulates. And where does it accumulate most? In the places where DNA is most exposed and most vulnerable, in the telomeres. The research from Eppel and Blackburn at UCSF published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences made this connection explicit. Women who reported higher levels of chronic stress, and whose stress was independently confirmed through objective measures, showed telomere lengths in their immune cells that were consistent with a decade or more of additional biological aging compared to low-stress controls. A decade. Not a marginal difference, a decade of cellular aging attributable, in significant part, to the physiological state associated with chronic stress. Third, and I think this one gets underestimated, chronic cortisol impairs the brain's ability to rewire itself. Neuroplasticity. Your hippocampus, the structure most central to memory, spatial navigation, and learning, is particularly vulnerable to prolonged cortisol exposure. The neurons there are densely packed with cortisol receptors, which is useful for acute stress processing, but in the chronic pattern, those same receptors become a liability. Extended cortisol exposure causes dendritic retraction in the hippocampus. The dendrites, the branching parts of neurons that form connections with other neurons, actually pull back. The network becomes less richly connected, less adaptable, and with sustained exposure there's actual volume reduction, which has been documented in brain imaging studies. This is why chronic stress feels like it makes you slower, like your thinking is less clear, like you're less creative than you used to be. You're not imagining it. The structural substrate for those capacities is being undermined by your own stress hormones. And the thing that controls the stress hormone system, the thing that can either let it run continuously or periodically tell it to stand down, is vagal tone. And the thing that drives vagal tone is whether your diaphragm is functioning the way it's supposed to. I want to tell you about a discovery that I think is one of the most important pieces of neuroscience from the last decade, and that almost nobody outside academic circles knows about. There's a neuroscientist at UCLA named Jack Feldman. He's been studying the neural circuitry of breathing, and back in 1991, his group identified what's called the Pre-Bötzinger complex, a small cluster of neurons in the brainstem that generates the breathing rhythm. Think of it as the clock that your body runs the breathing program from. It was an important discovery. Then in 2017, a team at Stanford, building on Feldman's foundational work, published a paper in the journal Science that changed everything. What they found is that there's a specific subpopulation of neurons in the Pre-Bötzinger complex, about 175 of them, that project directly to the locus coeruleus. The locus coeruleus is the brain's primary center for arousal, alertness, and stress. It sends projections to virtually every region of the brain. When it's active, you're alert, vigilant, ready for action. When it's excessively active, you're anxious, distracted, unable to settle. What these 175 neurons do is carry information from the breathing rhythm directly into that arousal center. The rate and pattern of your breathing is being fed in real time into the structure that controls your brain's global arousal state. Slow, calm breathing at diaphragmatic depth quiets the activity of those neurons projecting to the locus coeruleus. Fast, shallow chest breathing, the kind associated with stress and poor diaphragmatic engagement, amplifies it. The conclusion that came out of that research is remarkable. Your breathing pattern is not just a response to your emotional state, it is an active input to it. The direction runs both ways. Your emotions influence your breathing. Yes, everyone knows that. But your breathing is simultaneously shaping your emotional state and your arousal level at a neurological level through a direct synaptic connection between your breathing rhythm generator and your brain's stress center. Mark Krasno, one of the senior researchers on that paper, said at the time, "These neurons, all 175 of them, are absolutely critical. If something is impairing or accelerating your breathing, your brain needs to know right away, and this is the pathway by which it does." Jack Feldman said, "The Pre-Bötzinger complex plays a key role in the effects of breathing on arousal and emotion, such as during meditation. The contemplative traditions got it right. Every ancient practice that used controlled breathing, yoga, Buddhist meditation, Taoist practices, they were working with a real physiological mechanism. The contemplative traditions got it right. They were working with a real physiological mechanism. Let me shift gears slightly and talk about exercise, because I think the diaphragm story connects to physical performance in a way that's often overlooked. You've probably heard that VO2 max is one of the strongest predictors of longevity we have. The data on this is extensive and consistent. A study published in JAMA Network Open in 2018, following over 122,000 patients, found that individuals with the lowest cardiorespiratory fitness had a fourfold increased mortality risk compared to those with the highest fitness levels. Fourfold. Every single 1 MET increase in cardiorespiratory fitness, that's roughly 3.5 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute, is associated with an approximately 13 to 15% reduction in all-cause mortality risk. Moving up just one quartile can mean a 50% reduction. Here's where the diaphragm comes in, and this is the piece most people miss. Your VO2 max is limited in part by the efficiency with which you can move air in and out of your lungs at high exercise intensity, and that depends directly on the strength and endurance of your respiratory muscles. Researchers have documented something called the respiratory muscle steel effect. During high-intensity exercise, when the diaphragm begins to fatigue, your body doesn't just let performance drop. Instead, it actually diverts blood away from your working skeletal muscles and redirects it to the diaphragm. Your brain essentially decides that maintaining breathing takes priority over maintaining running pace, and so your legs start getting less oxygen. Your performance drops, not because your legs have hit their limit, but because your diaphragm has. Training the diaphragm specifically improves respiratory efficiency. It reduces the metabolic cost of breathing at any given intensity. This has been shown to improve exercise performance and VO2 max even when total training load doesn't change. You get better because the pump is stronger. There's one more role of the diaphragm I want to cover before we get into what you can actually do. And it's one almost nobody talks about. Your diaphragm is also a pump for your lymphatic system. The lymphatic system is essentially the sanitation network of your body. It circulates a fluid called lymph, a clear liquid that collects cellular waste, dead cells, metabolic byproducts, and pathogens, and carries all of that to lymph nodes where it gets processed and returned to circulation. Lymph moves via pressure differentials created by muscular contractions. One of the primary mechanisms driving lymphatic circulation is the breathing cycle. When your diaphragm contracts and descends on an inhale, it creates a pressure drop in the chest and a pressure rise in the abdomen. This literally pumps lymph upward through the thoracic duct, the largest lymphatic vessel. When most people breathe shallowly, when the diaphragm isn't doing its full range of motion, that pump is working at a fraction of its capacity. Lymphatic circulation becomes sluggish. Tissue waste products accumulate. Inflammatory metabolites that should be cleared out tend to linger. This matters for aging because we now understand that the brain has its own version of a lymphatic system, called the glymphatic system, that clears waste products, including proteins associated with neurodegenerative disease. The early data suggests the mechanical aspects of breathing are involved in this clearance. This is one of the biological mechanisms underlying why sleep quality is so central to cognitive aging. The glymphatic system appears to be most active during sleep, when breathing is slower and deeper. When sleep is poor or shallow, that clearance is compromised and proteins accumulate. Okay, I've shown you the why. Now let's talk about the what. Before you change anything, I want you to know where you're starting from. Lie on your back or sit up straight. Put one hand on your chest, one hand on your belly button. Take 3 normal breaths. Which hand moves more? If it's the top hand, the chest. You are like the majority of adults who sit for most of their working day, primarily using your accessory breathing muscles instead of your diaphragm. That's not a character flaw. It's a postural adaptation to a seated, screen-centered life. But it's worth changing. The breathing practice that consistently shows up in the research is called resonance frequency breathing, or coherent breathing. The target is approximately 6 breaths per minute, 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out through the nose. Both the inhale and the exhale through the nose. Breathe in through your nose for a count of 5. As you breathe in, your belly should expand outward, not your chest. The chest can rise slightly at the end, but the initial movement should be the belly pushing forward. That's the diaphragm descending. Then breathe out through your nose for a count of 5, completely out. Let the belly fall back. That's 1 full breath cycle in seconds, 6 of those per minute. Now, when most people try this for the first time, it feels strange, maybe slightly uncomfortable. You might feel an urge to breathe before the 5 count is up. That urge is related to your carbon dioxide tolerance, your body's calibration for when it thinks it needs to take the next breath. With practice, that calibration shifts. The slowness starts to feel normal and comfortable. Start with 10 minutes a day. If you can do it in the morning, do it in the morning. Ideally before you pick up your phone. Cortisol follows a daily rhythm, peaking shortly after waking. 10 minutes of resonance breathing here moderates that peak. You're setting the hormonal tone for the day. After 2 or 3 weeks at 10 minutes, extend to 15. After that, aim for 20. That's the dose used in studies that show measurable changes in resting HRV. 20 sessions over 8 weeks consistently shows cortisol reduction and autonomic improvement. That's the window for resetting your baseline. Beyond practice, breathe through your nose by default. Throughout the day, not just during sessions, your paranasal sinuses produce a gas called nitric oxide. It is a signaling molecule and a vasodilator. It relaxes blood vessel walls, improving blood flow and oxygen delivery. Nasal breathing passes air through here. Mouth breathing bypasses this entirely. Researchers at the Karolinska Institute documented significant differences in nitric oxide delivery. Nasal breathing keeps the vascular delivery mechanism active, combating age-related vascular stiffness and blood pressure increases. It's a compound effect across thousands of breaths. Let me say something honestly. There's a lot of money in the longevity space. Supplements, NAD, peptides, senolytics. We focus on things at the end of the causal chain. Meanwhile, the upstream regulation, inflammation rate, cortisol, nervous system tone, often gets left out of the conversation. The diaphragm is not glamorous. It has no marketing budget. You can't put it in a bottle and charge $200 for it. It doesn't require a prescription or a $1,000 wearable. It just requires that you do something differently than you've been doing 17,000 times a day. And the data is there. The pathway is real, documented, and confirmed by independent research groups across cardiology, neuroscience, and molecular biology, from the Pre-Bötzinger complex all the way down to the length of your telomeres. This is a verified pathway, and your diaphragm is at the top of it. The diaphragm is not glamorous. It has no marketing budget, but it is at the top of a verified pathway that controls how fast you age. Here's what I want you to do. Do the hand test right now, or tonight in bed. If your chest is moving more, you've learned something vital about your physiology. Then tomorrow morning, before the phone, before the coffee, try 10 minutes. Lie back. 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out. Just that. Give yourself 8 weeks. Pay attention to how you feel, how you recover from stress, how you sleep. Aging is not entirely in your control, but the rate at which it runs is something you have real influence over. Your diaphragm has been working every moment of your life. The only question is whether it's working the way it was designed to. Go find out. Thanks for watching Winds of Thought. If this video changed how you think about breathing and aging, please hit that like button. It helps others discover this information too. Drop a comment and tell us, which hand moved more when you did the test, chest or belly? I read every comment, and I'll see you in the next one.